This episode is sponsored by Postman. Postman is the world's leading API collaboration platform, and they just launched Postman AI Agent Builder, the quickest way to build AI agents. Start building at postman.com/podcast/cloudcast.
Cloudcast Media presents from the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. This is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We are coming to you live from the massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hope everybody's doing well. Things are getting warm here in North Carolina. Daylight savings just right around the corner, so a little more sunlight in our life, a little more sunshine. Things are looking up. Hope everybody's doing well. And today, what I want to dive into on this weekend perspective is want to dive into this thing that's been floating around the last couple of weeks, but really I feel like it's been floating around for a long time, but it's kind of come back up the last couple of weeks. So for anybody kind of following the news, Mr. Elon Musk has been doing a bunch of work with the Doge project, the government accountability stuff here in the United States government. And one of the things that he's been trying to do as part of his kind of rooting out people to keep or to remove from the government is he's asking each of them to send a email once a week saying the 5 things that they did that week. And then somehow somebody is going to evaluate that and determine if they are still worthy of keeping their job. I don't really want to talk about that per se. I don't have a comment on that. I know there's people that have lots of comments on that, but I want to kind of talk about the concept, though, of the idea of the 5 things I did this week, because I got to thinking about it. And it's something that has been around our industry for a while. It just hasn't really been talked about very much, at least lately. I know, for example, and this goes back quite a ways. I put a link in the show notes. Jeff Bezos famously, once Amazon started getting a little bit bigger, he said, "Hey, it's too difficult to communicate between groups. We need to be a scalable technology first company." And basically sent out a memo that was a mandate that said all teams will communicate, will represent the services that they deliver, and they will communicate via APIs. And then there was like 5 rules that he sort of laid out in terms of how that should go about. And really what it was looking at essentially trying to create the corporation in the concept of how technology works. And we know technology patterns, we know how technology scales. And I think he was probably looking at it from the perspective of like, we're building these applications that scale to millions and millions of people. They involve lots and lots of services and communications. Why can't we do that on the human side of things? And so that was sort of, famously how Amazon began to, bring on new capabilities, new services and so forth. But it was very much I need to know what you're doing and I need to be able to kind of query what people are doing, what groups are doing and so forth. More recently, Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, there's been a lot of talk about this new book called The NVIDIA Way, in which one of the things that he does is people within NVIDIA, and I don't know all the details, and again, when you read the book, you can't always be sure that's 100% accurate, but basically people send him a top 5 things going on in the company type of thing, or top 5 things that people within the company should be aware of. And apparently he famously, these kind of come from anywhere in the company. The org chart sort of doesn't matter. And he goes about reading dozens or hundreds of these on a weekly basis. And it gives him a sense of, what's going on in the company? What's the pulse of the company? What are people thinking about? What are they concerned about? What things do they think they're doing well? What are competitors doing? And so it gives him a very broad view of, the marketplace, what people are spending time on, what good things they're producing that maybe don't easily bubble up through management reports and status reports and all those sort of things. So, there's definitely precedent for, this type of communication happening. Now, granted, those are 2, kind of technology-centric companies using that mechanism, but the mechanism itself isn't really, new or unique. I think the ability as organizations get bigger, they get wider, the ability to sort of know what people are doing is more difficult. It just naturally is more difficult. People have less time in the day to keep track of everything. The leadership has less visibility as to what's going on. And obviously, management has different ways at different levels of the chain of, communicating what they do. But I got to thinking about it, and I was thinking about it from my own perspective. If my management chain sort of said, "Hey, I need you to do this every week," what would I go about doing? How would I go about trying to utilize it for myself in order to make myself better at what I do, but also utilizing it in a way that's going to be beneficial to the company, and then sort of think about as it bubbles its way up the organization. And so, as I was thinking about this, the first thing that came to mind, and I've seen this in a lot of organizations, a lot of groups, the first thing that comes to mind when this stuff pops up is there's all sorts of things that could be perceived as negative, right? However, the request for this information, this accountability, this, status of what you've done, the first thing that always comes up is sort of well, here's all the reasons this is a bad idea. Here's all the reasons this could go wrong, right? Whether it's, what format should we use so that it's easy to digest? Should this be long form? Should it be short form? I know Cote and I talked on his podcast a couple of weeks ago. Should internal communication be done via video? Should be done via email? Should be done via wiki or some other way that accounts for this stuff? That always gets talked about. Like, what's the right format? What do people like to do? There's always the discussion of how much will people actually say when you have to put your name on it? So if you're simply asking people what they did, that's fine. But if you begin asking them, what do you think is important? What are 5 important things you're working on? Whatever that thing might be, you're going to get into situations in which, how they're represented and are they represented from the individual perspective? Are they represented from the team perspective? Should there be an aspect of anonymization that happens? So if, for example, you're giving feedback about managers or about teams or company strategy, so there's always going to be lots of people that can give you a long list of what are all the negatives that can come from this. And sometimes those negatives are very real. So for example, one of the pushbacks against some of the Elon Musk stuff, beyond all the sort of political rhetoric and so forth is, if this is happening as just email within the government, things that are secretive or things that don't need to be known by certain people could be out in the open. Email is easy to hack, not the most secure form of communication. So, there are things like that sort of come up that you go, okay, well, there's some reality to that, or there's some, legitimate concern versus, I just don't really want to have to represent what I do every 5 days because it's hard for me to do, or it's extra work or whatever it might be. But what I thought I would try and do today is really talk more about what are the ways in which you as an individual or you as a manager or a leader of a group could sort of use this mechanism, this activity to sort of make the organization better. All right. Whether, again, you're thinking about it from the perspective of you, trying to represent your work, you're trying to think about getting promoted, you're trying to put yourself in a situation in which you can take on more things because it's either career aspirational or, again, you're looking to grow your career, whatever it might be. But also, what are the things from a management perspective that you may want to try and do, to better your team, to better the organization, to create more collaboration across teams, those sort of things. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that today, and then I'll sort of wrap up towards the end about 5 things I did this past week and sort of how I would go about thinking about them in the context of some of the stuff we're talking about. So the first thing that I had on my list was, how do you keep track of your work, right? How do you keep track of it? How do you communicate it? And is it easy to understand, what you did, how it aligns to either team goals or company goals? And, how do you go about when you're in the middle of things, when status and accountability sometimes feels like, well, we know this is a 6-month project. We're into week 3, telling you that we went from, 4% to 7% done seems not terribly interesting. How do you go about kind of keeping track of that stuff? So, and again, this is just me personally. I bet if Aaron got on here, he would tell you a different way, and different guests on the show would tell you different ways. One of the things I do is I typically try and keep things in a spreadsheet so that it's for me, it's historical. It's useful. Both, it allows me to be able to sort of linearly see what I've been working on. It allows me to, easy to search, easy to copy and paste. I'm always looking for ways that not only is it easy for me to input things, but it's also easy for me to share them in a way that doesn't require a lot of reformatting, doesn't require a lot of rework. And people can, if they want to then go about sharing it as well, it's fairly easy. So I really think about those 2 things, easy for me to do. And number 2, easy to make it shareable. And then the second piece of it is how do you communicate your work? And I think this is the thing that people probably misunderstand the most, or they get wrong the most, right? I think the natural inclination is to say, well, really what we're doing is we are accounting for stuff. Let's try and put some numbers against it, or let's try and provide a status of what's going on, something along those lines. And I think what people fail to do is sort of the secondary order things, which is you did some work. Somebody asked you to do some work, or you took the initiative to do some work. But what was the intention of this? What was the goal? What was the alignment of this to something bigger, right? Like, did you do something that reduced cost out of the system? Did you do something that is foundational to help the company grow revenue or grow market share? Did you do something that, took, a top problem that your customers have complained about and you reduced it by some percent, right? And I think that's the thing that the people sort of fail to do the most is connect the dots between, think about it this way. If your manager had to roll up 10 of you, right, 10 people worth of stuff, what are they going to roll up to their manager, to the next level person? And so, what they're going to have to try and do is go, okay, am I aligned to what were our team's goals or our team's KPIs? And the way to think about this, and maybe the simplest way to think about this, is always be thinking about what does your boss need to communicate? What's going to make your boss represent your group in the best way possible? And secondarily, what does your boss's boss need to do? What are his goals, and how are you a part of that? And I think for so many people, they don't really realize those two things. They think about themselves or their small group and the task that they're working on, and they don't necessarily think about it in the bigger context of like, what do my next couple immediate bosses, managers, CEO, however big or small your company is, what are the things that are most important to them, and how are we aligned to those things, right? Because if what you do is just create a list of stuff that is stuff, and then you put the burden and the onus on the people above you to figure out like, well, what did that do, right? Like, okay, you fixed some bugs or you created some content, but like, what was that for? And the reason I mention that is if you're thinking in that way and you're communicating things in that way, it does two things. Number one, it gives you a very good path to figure out like, should we be doing this? Like, why does somebody ask for this? And if it doesn't seem to sort of make sense, or it's not easy to connect the dots sort of upward or, to team goals and so forth, you sometimes have to ask like, are you asking for the wrong thing? Or did I understand the thing that you're asking for, but it doesn't make any sense as to why you're asking for it, right? Like, I understand you might be asking for it, but is that really your job? You should be doing it as opposed to we're doing it because it doesn't, and I think that's a very fair thing to ask people is, how does this align to whatever goals, as opposed to, can you describe the work to me, right? And then, so I think that's the most important thing to be doing is, obviously you want to represent what you're doing in a way that's easy to understand. But I think that the thinking sort of second order, third order, if you think about throwing a pebble in a lake or a rock in a lake, those expansion of ripples, how are you impacting the second order ripple, the third order ripple, the fourth order ripple? The second thing is, I think you want to be thinking about, let's suppose you're doing whatever task you're doing, and you represent that for 52 weeks of the year. How are you communicating that it's getting better? How are you communicating the totality of it, the direction of it, the scope of it, the impact of it? And I think that's the other thing that people seem to forget or don't really understand at the individual level is, how is the work that I'm doing rolling up to things? How is it making a bigger impact? How does it help improve the scope of what we're working on? Like, how would you represent what you do if you had to give it to your boss and your boss had to go, well, that's fine. You told me in 5 minutes, but I only have 30 seconds to represent this, right? So always be sort of thinking about it in that context. I think the second thing that I had on my list is, especially in today's market, right? We're in a tough job market. Companies have had layoffs. People are saying that it's taking them a long time to find new jobs, and we're just in one of these troughs right now where, in our industry across lots of different roles, it's harder and harder to find jobs, which ultimately means that if you are gainfully employed, if you're working, if you're doing the things you're doing, you need to value the fact that you're working. And so you want to be thinking, okay, how do I represent accountability to the people that I'm working for and with and in coordination with, right? Because there's going to be a certain amount of kind of accountability across all sorts of different jobs and all sorts of different industries, whether it's influenced by like, could AI do something, or just, what's the profitability of the business, or what's the economic situation with the world. You in certain cases, and especially in tough markets, accountability is a kind of key ability, if you will, right? Reliability, sustainability, it's a important ability, right? So, take it seriously, but also think about it in the context of not just, am I checking the boxes? Did I tell you what my numbers were for this week for whatever things that you're supposed to do? But how do I further connect it to something that's bigger, so that, as people are looking at, do we need that group? Do we need those people? Is that the best person in the group? You've communicated and represented yourself the best way you can. The next thing to really understand, and this is both something that you can impact and something that you need to understand, is how is your management chain communicating this upward, right? Like, what does your boss do? What does your group do? How do you present the information to other people? And then again, thinking about it in the context of like, okay, did we give them context? Like, why are we doing those things? Because if you'd be surprised, and again, this depends on how often you talk to different teams within your organization, or you meet with different organizations. It's amazing how many times that people tell you what they do and you go, why is that a job? Like, what does that do? Why is that necessary? Who asked for that sort of thing? Like, and usually there are very, very good reasons for things, but oftentimes after people have been doing things for a long time, you sort of forget what that is. And so this is something to ask your management chain, right? Like, you're asking us for the 5 things we did this week. How are you then representing it? Because again, what ends up happening is more and more things, as they sort of filter up the chain, even, whether it's upward and downward or east and west, things kind of get lost. They get summarized. They look for the highlights, and then the next group looks for the highlights of the highlights, and so forth. And so you really want to ask yourself, like, how are you representing our stuff? And maybe it's as simple as being like, well, we're asked to send an email to the next group, and you go, okay, that's fine. But let's suppose those emails don't get read, right? For a couple of weeks, somebody goes on vacation, or, something important is going on and people just are distracted, don't have time. Where do you keep the stuff? If somebody want to historically look at your group, how would they do that? Like, let's say a new management person came in, like, how would they quickly get up to speed on your group? Do you represent things as just, statuses? Oh, we moved from 17% done to 19% done. Or do you try and put it into context for things, right? So I think so much of it is trying to provide people with a bigger picture of what you're doing and how you are aligned. And again, if your management chain is not doing those sort of things, and you should absolutely ask them, for, how are you communicating things? And then you may also ask, does that form of communication work, right? And this is where you get into things like, well, 2 bosses above me or other people, they only work in that way. That's the way their brain works. And you go, okay, that's fine, right? Good or bad, people learn different ways. They take in things different ways. But that's when you may also ask yourself, like, okay, if that's the case, is the way that we're communicating things easily then rolled up, summarized, highlighted, context, so that it gets into that format the right way, right? So again, you're trying to understand sort of the supply chain of how all this stuff works. And you may be thinking, well, that doesn't really matter. I filled out my form, I did my thing, I did whatever. It absolutely matters, because ultimately, when you're in times when times are tough, or times are accountable, or you're hoping to get the bigger project, you're hoping to get more visibility. If, the way that your team or the way that you communicate gets totally lost going up the value chain or up the management chain, you need to figure out, like, okay, how do we fix that? How do we get into a way that becomes more visible, more valuable, more contextual, and so on and so forth? The next thing you may want to ask yourself, and again, this may be of yourself individually or as a group, is not what did you do, but what shouldn't have been done? What could have been skipped? What What could we ignore for a while? And then use that time to fill it in with something else that's sitting on your backlog that is more important, that is equally as important. And so it's often a good question to ask of like, not only what you did, but what could you have skipped? What could you have ignored? What process could get better by taking 2 steps out of it? And I think that's just as important to sort of highlight, right? That might be something that you can't fix right away, but you come back and say, look, I realized, like, I'll give you an example. I've been digging into some of the developer assistance tool, AI types tools. And, one of the things that you get from digging into that is, you can figure out like, okay, how much code would an assistant write? How much could this assist? Could it make it 15%, 20%? But then you also get into realizing when people have studied developers, the fullness of what a developer does in any given day or any given week, there's as much time that they spend in meetings or in status updates or in, code review or whatever it is. And you really kind of understand, okay, the thing that we think they do is only 20 or 30% of their time, 40% of their time. What are they doing with the other percents of their time? Should we try and tackle some of those issues just as vigorously or importantly or prioritized as we do the thing that we think is somebody's primary job, right? So I think that sort of looking at the holistic of it is really, really important. And the last thing I had on my list was, does your team, does your management use this, whatever statuses that they get and they roll up and so forth? Do they use it for 2 things? Number one, do they use it to educate? If you're part of a broader organization, do they use it to educate other people on what the broader things do, right? Because oftentimes what you find is there are lots of people that do a lot of things, and people will, again, coming back to this, like, well, what do you guys do? I don't understand. Like, what does that function do? Like, how do you guys measure yourself? And oftentimes, if you only sort of live in your bubble, in your world, in your swim lane, and you may have a lot of experience having done other things in other places. It's an opportunity to educate the group on kind of the holisticness of all the things that people do to get to the end product that you deliver, the end service that you deliver, the end application that you deliver, whatever it might be. But it also gives people a better sense of like, oh, okay, those are the constraints that they're currently under, right? They're operating 4 people short right now, or, oh, they are, maybe they're now impacted by one of these tariffs and they're having to implement a new system that they didn't have to do before, or, oh, that group has to do 40% of the stuff they do with another group that is in 5 time zones differently. And so their effectiveness is oftentimes, reduced because, there's only 2 hours a day overlap of the work that they do and all that kind of stuff. So I think there's an opportunity there when these things roll up for management to use them as an education opportunity, but also to look at them as, are there things cross-functionally that as we know more, we could do better, right? So I think, looking at that is a very important thing. So I'm going to wrap it up with that. I think there is potentially a lot of value in that. I think, how your company goes about doing it, if you do it to the extreme that Jeff Bezos recommended, with making everything an API, okay, may or may not work in your organization. Should it just be, a 5 things email that gets sent up to the CEO every day? Maybe not, right? Depends on, again, your organization, your CEO and so forth. But I think some of the other things that I talked about, whether it's how you go about keeping track of it, how you go about using it to represent yourself. Because again, a lot of these things you want to be able to represent yourself so that when the next promotion cycle comes along, when the next bigger job opportunity comes along, you are representing the wholeness of what you do. So you want to keep track of your work. You want to think about how it's communicated. What's the context? What's the relevance to bigger things? You want to talk about accountability. I mean, I think the need for accountability is something that, people kind of have to do themselves. Management can push that on certain things, but I think you got to have people that want to be accountable. But then again, the other things we talked about is, do you understand how it's being communicated? Do you understand how it's being contextualized? Do you understand how it's being highlighted? All those things are important, and those are very valid questions to ask of your boss, of your boss's boss, of your team. How are we taking advantage of all this information that we're sharing? So I thought I would finish up. I said I'd finish up. Here's my 5 things for the week and how I would think about them in terms of alignment or cross functionality or context. So I wrote about a bunch of things this last week. I wrote a keynote for a big event we have coming up. I worked on a training that's being used by a bunch of new hires from my organization, and I built a webinar that's going to be part of a series of about 40 or 50 cities that'll go out, as we go out and talk to prospective customers and so forth. So those I would represent, not only what they are, because they have a distinct thing that can be shared. So a link to a PowerPoint, or, link to a set of slides, or a link to a video, but also, I'd want to communicate, ways in which somebody else could go, okay, this is how it could be used. But I think the way I would mostly communicate it is, these are activities that are going to touch thousands of people, both internally and externally. They are part of, preparing our sales force, preparing how we interact with our customers, but also, bringing together a number of executives to make sure that we have alignment around key messaging, key product strategy, and so forth. So that one is really going to be mostly about scope, as well as, sharing some things that can be distinctly shared. The second thing I had on my list was I worked with a couple of the technical teams on building some demos. They actually were the ones building the demos. I was really kind of giving them feedback to make sure we had the right balance between would a business audience understand this? Would a technical audience understand this? Does it align to broader corporate messaging? Does it fit the vehicle we have for distributing it? So again, that is really more internal sort of mentoring, internal feedback, trying to think in the bigger context of like, who would use this? Why would they use this? So again, trying to put some bigger thinking around something that, you could just say, well, this is just a demo. Okay. Third thing, had meetings with 3 different cross-functional teams. So again, this is both education about what's going on, looking for, how the cross-functional teams do things. So this is really trying to represent your scope and role at a certain level, right? Like you are, not just doing the job that you do, but you're part of these broader teams. And then what was the impact of those things? And again, these meetings were, in this case, they just happen to be sort of like regularly scheduled status meetings. But you'd want to communicate, like, why are you going about doing this? What's the hope that these 2 or 3 different teams coming together is trying to bring to the company? Fourth thing I had was, attended a couple of things to help improve my knowledge. Again, this is something you'd probably represent as more of an individual type of thing. I spent 2 hours on certain types of learning, whether it's, what your company does, what the market does, and so on and so forth. But you want to be showing an active, trying to improve the skills that you have. Companies really aren't necessarily sending people off to training anymore. So you do want to show that, yes, I took some company time, but I'm taking the initiative to improve myself, to improve my knowledge. And that type of skill set and knowledge will be applicable to, bigger tasks that I'm working on, right? So it could be what we put in the keynote or whatever it might be. And then the last thing I had on my list was spend some time mentoring a junior coworker. So again, that's trying to represent, what level of work that you do, but also how are you trying to take that level of expertise or experience and reinforce that with younger people in the organization, junior people in the organization, whatever that might be. And again, trying to help the organization grow internally, using our own internal resources. And again, that can be cost savings because you don't have to send somebody out to training, or you're just building better rapport with people in the organization, and you're trying to help them, become, better equipped to do things within the organization. So again, 5 sort of regular tasks that you might do in any given week. People do all sorts of things, but tried to explain a little bit of how I'd put some context around it and try and make it seem a little bit bigger than just, I did these 5 things. I met with these 3 people. I did this learning or whatever. I think you really want to think about, how do I put it into the context of, this is why this was important. This was the goal that we're sort of moving towards. This is aligned to, bigger corporate company trends, corporate trends and goals and so forth. And I think in doing that, if you're doing that on a constant, consistent basis, the people that are hearing that, or that it's being rolled up to, are going to look at you in a light in which, is going to be hopefully bigger than the context of your individual job. So anyways, just some thoughts around this whole, 5 things I did this week, kind of new trend that's been floating around, whether people like it or not. I think the way to think about it, at least from my perspective, look at it find the positives of it, find the positives in terms of, how you're representing what you're doing, how you're prioritizing what you're doing, how you're communicating what you're doing, and then use it to think about, how can this be used to try and improve the company? Because again, right now, in tougher markets, in tighter markets, in uncertain markets, people that are driving towards accountability, just, you make your boss's life easier. And sometimes, those folks, get less grief sometimes if those things are going on. So anyways, hopefully this was useful. Hopefully you are starting to enjoy a little bit of more sunlight, daylight in your day. And I know we're excited about the warmer weather coming along. It's going to be some 75 or so degrees here in North Carolina. So things are getting better, shorts weather, which we love. So anyways, hope everybody's doing well. Hope everybody, if we can help you, as always, show@thecloudcast.net. I know some folks have reached out recently. Again, we try and do our best with those types of things. But, again, show@thecloudcast.net. All our social media channels are in the show notes at the bottom if you ever need to reach out to us. And with that, I'll wrap it up. I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to The Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more shows, show notes, videos, and everything social media.